Hidden within the pages of Scripture is a story that many skip over quickly, a story that does not begin with power or recognition, but one that carries eternal weight. It is the story of Tamar, a woman whose name might not be as familiar as Abraham, David, or Mary, yet her life was woven directly into the line of the Messiah. She's not remembered for wealth or prestige, but for her courage, her determination, and her place in God's mysterious plan of redemption. Tamar's story is often overlooked because it does not appear polished or comfortable. It begins with loss, betrayal, and uncertainty, leaving her vulnerable in a society where a woman's future depended on others. Yet what makes her story extraordinary is not how it began, but how God used her perseverance to shape history. From the shadows of sorrow, her life became a foundation for the line that would lead to Jesus Christ. What may at first seem like a quiet, hidden story is actually one of the most powerful reminders that God's purposes are never bound by human failure. Tamar shows us that even in situations filled with pain or confusion, God is still at work. Her presence in the genealogy of Jesus at the very opening of the Gospel of Matthew is not a coincidence. It is a declaration that God chooses to work through unexpected people and circumstances to bring about His perfect plan. Her life calls us to pay attention, to look deeper, and to understand that what might seem small or forgotten is often the very place where God is moving most powerfully. Tamar's courage speaks across the centuries, inviting us to reflect on our own lives, reminding us that our struggles do not disqualify us from being part of God's story. Instead, they can become the very stage on which His grace is revealed. As we step into Tamar's journey, we discover that her voice still speaks today. She stands as a testimony of resilience, a beacon for anyone who has felt overlooked, and a reminder that God's plans are greater than our brokenness. Through her story, we are encouraged to trust that even in silence and waiting, God is writing something that will last beyond our imagination. If stories like this encourage you and help you see the Bible in a fresh way, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and leave a comment below. Your support helps bring these powerful messages to more people who need to hear them. When Tamar first enters the biblical record, it is not through a moment of triumph or joy, but through a marriage that soon turns into sorrow. She was given as a wife to the firstborn son of Judah, one of the 12 sons of Jacob. This meant that Tamar had been drawn into one of the most important families in Israel's story, a family chosen by God to carry forward the covenant promise. Yet, her position did not bring security. Instead, her marriage was marked by hardship, and almost immediately, Tamar's path was shaped by loss. The text offers little detail about her life before this union. We do not know her family background or what expectations she carried into this marriage, but we do know that she became a widow very quickly. The silence of Scripture on her personal dreams or hopes reflects the way many women of her time were overlooked, their stories tied to the choices and actions of others. Tamar's silence at the start of the narrative mirrors the silence often placed upon women in ancient society, where their future depended on the men around them. In the cultural context of her time, being a widow was more than personal grief. It meant social and economic vulnerability. Without a husband and without children, a woman had little standing. Her security rested upon the customs of her community and the willingness of her husband's family to provide for her. Tamar found herself at this crossroads very quickly, facing an uncertain future not of her own making. Judah, as the patriarch of the household, held the authority to decide what would happen to Tamar. According to the custom of levirate marriage, a brother of the deceased was expected to take the widow as his wife in order to raise up children in the name of the one who had died. This tradition was not merely about family honor, but about ensuring that a woman was not left destitute. For Tamar, this meant that her life would now be tied to Judah's second son, Onan. Her new marriage was not one of choice, but of obligation, reflecting the structure of her society. While it may have seemed that this custom would secure Tamar's future, the reality proved far different. Onan did not honor the responsibility placed upon him. His actions reflected selfishness and disregard for both Tamar and the family line he was meant to continue. This left Tamar once again vulnerable, widowed a second time, her dignity and future pushed further into uncertainty. At this point, Tamar's situation must have felt unbearably heavy. Twice married, twice widowed, still without a child, she stood in a position no one would have desired. And yet, the narrative makes clear that she was not forgotten by the unfolding story of God. Though she had little voice and little control, her presence remained central to what was to come. Her suffering was not the end, but the beginning of a much larger journey. Judah now faced a decision that would alter Tamar's life yet again. He had one remaining son, Shelah, but he judged that the time was not yet right for him to marry. Instead of providing Tamar with the security that the custom required, Judah sent her back to her father's house, telling her to wait until Shelah was grown. This arrangement placed Tamar in a strange in-between space, neither fully belonging to Judah's household nor entirely free to move on with her life. Waiting in her father's house, Tamar experienced not only the loneliness of widowhood, but also the uncertainty of a promise that might never be fulfilled. Her future was suspended on Judah's word, a word that carried great weight, yet would later prove unreliable. Her situation reflects the plight of many who find themselves waiting, trusting in others to keep their commitments, yet discovering that promises can be delayed or even broken. This shadowed beginning does not shine with hope, but instead with silence, loss, and unfulfilled expectations. Tamar's place in the story seems small, hidden, and without resolution. Yet it is precisely in such moments that the deeper movements of history are at work. Tamar's story was not finished, though everything around her suggested an ending. What began as a life marked by tragedy was about to become a story marked by courage. Tamar's introduction may feel like a descent into hopelessness, but it was laying the foundation for a remarkable demonstration of resilience. Out of silence would come a bold voice. Out of waiting would come decisive action. Out of broken promises would come a legacy that could not be erased. Tamar's future had been bound by Judah's word, a word given when he instructed her to remain in her father's house until Shelah, his youngest son, came of age. According to the custom, once Shelah was grown, he was to marry Tamar and provide her with the security and children that had been denied her through the deaths of his brothers. This was not merely a matter of family honor, but of justice, ensuring that Tamar's life would not remain in a state of limbo. Yet as time passed, it became clear that Judah had no intention of fulfilling this promise. Perhaps he feared that giving Shelah to Tamar would bring misfortune upon his last son, or perhaps he simply grew careless with the weight of his responsibility. Whatever the reasoning, Judah's hesitation created an injustice. Tamar had done nothing to deserve her plight, and yet she was left waiting, abandoned to uncertainty. For Tamar, this betrayal was not simply about a broken family arrangement. It was about being denied the very security and dignity she was entitled to by the customs of her people. Her life was held in suspension, marked by an absence of justice. Each passing day must have deepened the sense that her place within Judah's household was slipping away, that her future might be erased altogether. The betrayal carried a weight far beyond her personal suffering. In failing Tamar, Judah failed to uphold the very traditions that bound his family together. His inaction was not just a private failure, but a fracture in the covenantal responsibilities that shaped Israelite life. Tamar stood as a victim of promises unkept, her voice unheard in a system that demanded silence from women like her. The silence of Tamar during this period speaks loudly. She did not lash out in anger, nor did she abandon her place. She waited, observing, and carried the weight of betrayal with dignity. Yet beneath the silence, there was a stirring resilience. Tamar may have been wronged, but she would not remain powerless forever. Judah's broken promise created a vacuum of justice, one that could not remain unaddressed. The tradition of levirate marriage was designed to protect the vulnerable, but in this case, the very tradition that was meant to bring life was used as a cover for delay and avoidance. Tamar, left without a husband and without a child, embodied the cost of Judah's failure. It is in these moments of injustice that the true character of individuals is revealed. Judah's unwillingness to act showed a lack of courage, but Tamar's waiting revealed her quiet strength. Though bound by the customs of her day, she was already preparing to take a stand against the injustice that had been forced upon her. The waiting must have felt endless. Each season that passed was a reminder that Shelah had grown, yet no fulfillment of Judah's promise came. Tamar's life remained in limbo, yet her story did not fade away. Instead, the silence became the backdrop against which her boldness would later shine even more brightly. Her situation captures a timeless truth about human experience. Promises broken by others can leave us vulnerable, uncertain, and disappointed. Yet out of that disappointment can emerge a new resolve. Tamar would not be defined by betrayal alone. She was waiting for the moment when she could act, when she could step out of silence and into courage. This betrayal marked a turning point, not because Tamar found resolution, but because her patience began to transform into determination. If Judah would not act with justice, Tamar herself would become the agent through which justice would take shape. Her silence was not the end of her voice, but the preparation for it. What seemed like weakness was only the quiet before a bold step into history. Tamar had been patient, but patience without action could not secure her future. Judah's failure left her with few options, yet she refused to accept a life of quiet despair. She saw that if she remained passive, her lineage and her dignity would vanish into silence. It was in this crucible of waiting and betrayal that Tamar's courage rose. She began to form a plan, one that would carry immense risk, yet one that would allow her to claim the justice she had been denied. She learned that Judah was traveling to a place called Timnah, where he would oversee the shearing of his sheep. This moment presented an opportunity, and Tamar recognized it. She removed her widow's garments, which had marked her state of mourning and vulnerability, and carefully chose a disguise that would conceal her identity. Her decision was not reckless, but purposeful. She was preparing to confront the very man who had failed her, not with words of accusation, but with a bold act that would secure her place in the family line. The risk she carried cannot be overstated. If her disguise were discovered too soon, she could be cast into disgrace or worse. If her plan failed, she would not only lose the little standing she had, but also any chance of justice. Yet Tamar was not acting out of rebellion. She was acting to reclaim what had been unjustly withheld. Her courage was not a rejection of tradition, but an insistence that it be honored, that the responsibilities of Judah's house not be erased. When Judah encountered her in disguise, he did not recognize her. The veil concealed her identity, and he engaged with her, unaware that this was the very woman to whom he had denied justice. Tamar requested a pledge from him, asking for items that would unmistakably mark his identity: a seal, a cord, and a staff. These objects were not just ordinary belongings, but symbols of Judah's authority and personal signature. By securing them, Tamar ensured that the truth would one day be revealed. Her wisdom is evident in this choice. She did not act without foresight. She prepared for the moment when her actions would be called into question, and she made sure that the truth could be proven beyond denial. The very items Judah gave her would become the instruments of her vindication. This moment reveals not only Tamar's boldness, but also her clarity of purpose. She did not allow fear to dictate her actions. She faced the risks with careful thought, securing the evidence she would need to protect herself. Her determination shines as an example of resilience in the face of overwhelming obstacles. After their encounter, Tamar returned to her life in silence, carrying the secret of what had transpired. She once again clothed herself in her widow's garments, returning to the appearance of waiting, though now she held within her the seed of her future and the pledge that would one day speak louder than words. The daring nature of her plan underscores the depth of her courage. Few would have taken such a risk, yet Tamar saw that without it, she would remain forgotten, her place in the family erased. Her actions were not simply for survival, but for justice, for the continuation of a line that had been unjustly withheld. Her disguise was temporary, but the legacy it created would be lasting. In a world where women's voices were often silenced, Tamar's bold step forced her story into the light. She had acted not out of defiance, but out of a determination to uphold what was rightfully hers. What began in silence had now become a daring act of wisdom. Tamar's choice to disguise herself was not an act of rebellion, but a step toward justice. She did not abandon the tradition of her people. She demanded that it be honored, even if it meant taking matters into her own hands. The courage she displayed would soon bring the story to its dramatic turning point. Not long after her encounter with Judah, Tamar's secret could no longer remain hidden. Word reached the household that she was pregnant, and with that news came accusations. For a widow bound to Judah's family, such news carried a weight of shame in the eyes of the community. The judgment was swift, and Tamar faced the possibility of disgrace. Judah himself, unaware of his own role in the matter, responded harshly. His words reflected the cultural expectations of the time, where a woman's honor was tightly bound to the household she belonged to. For Tamar, the moment must have felt like the collapse of everything she had carefully risked and planned. She stood at the edge of ruin, accused by the very man who had denied her justice. Yet Tamar had not acted without foresight. In her hands, she carried the pledge Judah had given her, the seal, the cord, and the staff that marked his identity unmistakably. At the critical moment, she brought them forward, not with loud accusation, but with quiet, undeniable truth. She did not need to shout her case or defend herself with lengthy words. The evidence spoke on her behalf. When Judah saw the items, the truth pierced him. He recognized them as his own, and in that instant, the roles were reversed. The one who had stood in judgment now stood convicted by his own actions. His response was one of humility and confession. He declared openly, "She is more righteous than I," acknowledging that he had failed in his responsibility while Tamar had acted with integrity. This turning point reveals the depth of Tamar's wisdom. She did not expose Judah too soon, nor did she seek to humiliate him. She waited until the truth could be revealed in its full clarity, at a time when it would not only vindicate her, but also force Judah to confront his failure. Her patience and foresight ensured that justice was not only claimed, but publicly acknowledged. In this moment, Tamar was no longer the silent widow or the forgotten promise. She became the voice of justice, the one who stood firm when all others had faltered. Judah's confession did not erase the pain she had endured, but it did shift the narrative. The one who had been accused now stood vindicated, her honor restored. The beauty of this turning point lies not only in Tamar's vindication, but in the transformation it brought to Judah himself. By confronting his own failure, Judah began a journey of change that would later shape his role within the family of Israel. Tamar's courage and persistence had not only secured her own future, but had also forced a reckoning that impacted the entire household. Her story reminds us that truth, though often hidden for a time, cannot remain concealed forever. When the moment comes, it shines with a power that cannot be denied. Tamar's vindication was not the result of chance, but of wisdom, patience, and the courage to act when all seemed against her. The turning point of her story was not simply about avoiding disgrace. It was about being publicly recognized for her righteousness, about shifting the balance of justice in a world that had denied it to her. Her life, once marked by silence and vulnerability, now stood as a testimony of strength and resilience. What seemed destined for shame became a moment of honor. What was intended for judgment became a declaration of righteousness. Tamar, once cast into the shadows of uncertainty, now stood vindicated in the light of truth. Her story was no longer one of loss and betrayal alone, but of justice secured, dignity restored, and a future preserved. The turning point in Tamar's story opened the door to a new chapter of her life, one that would carry both personal fulfillment and lasting significance for generations to come. From her union with Judah, Tamar gave birth to twin sons, Perez and Zerah. Their arrival was more than the continuation of a family line. It was the unfolding of a divine plan that would one day lead to the greatest story ever told. What had begun as despair and injustice now took shape as a legacy that would echo through time. The birth of twins itself carried symbolic weight. In ancient culture, twins often signified a struggle or a tension between destinies, a reminder that God's purposes are not always straightforward. As Tamar's sons were born, a dramatic moment unfolded. Zerah, the first to extend his hand, was briefly marked with a scarlet thread to indicate his priority. Yet Perez, whose name means breaking forth, ultimately emerged as the true firstborn, defying expectations. This reversal reflected the mystery of God's work, where the expected path is often overturned by his greater design. Tamar must have looked upon her sons with a sense of both relief and awe. After so many years of silence, widowhood, and betrayal, her arms were finally filled with the children she had long awaited. No longer was she left vulnerable or voiceless. Through Perez and Zerah, her life gained both stability and significance. What society had once denied her was now restored, and more than restored, magnified into a heritage far greater than she could have imagined. Perez would go on to play a vital role in the unfolding history of Israel. His descendants included leaders and warriors, and through his line came King David, Israel's greatest king. Beyond David, the genealogy traced by the Gospel of Matthew shows that Perez was written directly into the family tree of Jesus Christ, the Messiah. This means that Tamar, through her persistence and courage, was directly connected to the story of salvation itself. The story of Perez's birth is often seen as symbolic of breakthrough. His unexpected emergence reflects how God's purposes break through human obstacles and expectations. Tamar's life had been marked by barriers, by promises unfulfilled, by a future that seemed locked away. Yet her son's very name testified to the reality that God brings forth life, hope, and legacy, even when the way seems blocked. Zerah, though overshadowed by his brother's role, still carried significance as well. The scarlet thread tied to his hand at birth reminds us of how close the path of destiny can seem before being redirected. His presence alongside Perez highlights the richness of Tamar's legacy, a double portion of blessing after years of waiting. Her womb, once silent, now bore twins, a living symbol of abundance and restoration. Through these children, Tamar was no longer defined by the betrayals she had endured. She became a matriarch, honored not only in her time, but in the entire sweep of biblical history. Her story demonstrates that God does not allow injustice to have the last word. Instead, he turns broken circumstances into the soil from which his purposes grow. The prophetic weight of her son's birth points beyond her own household. Perez's role in the genealogy of Christ reminds us that God's plan for redemption was already being woven together, thread by thread, through the lives of people who could not see its full shape. Tamar's persistence ensured that her place in this plan was secured, and through her, the Messiah's line continued unbroken. Tamar's legacy is a testimony that what seems lost can be restored, that what seems hidden can be brought into light, and that what seems ordinary can be part of something extraordinary. Her sons carried forward not only her name, but the promise of God's faithfulness through generations. Her story, which began in sorrow, now resounded with hope. By bringing forth Perez and Zerah, Tamar's life became a bridge between silence and salvation, between despair and destiny. The children she held in her arms were more than her personal joy. They were living symbols of how God transforms broken stories into prophetic legacies. Tamar's journey might have appeared scandalous to those who observed it from the outside. Her disguise, her encounter with Judah, and the circumstances of her pregnancy were far from the polished images of virtue people might have expected. Yet it is precisely this complexity that reveals the depth of God's mysterious plan. What looked like shame in the eyes of men became the very path through which God advanced his work of salvation. The story of Tamar reminds us that God does not select only the flawless or the outwardly honorable to carry forward his purposes. He chooses people in their weakness, in their struggle, and even in the midst of situations that appear messy or misunderstood. Tamar's determination to secure justice placed her within the line of Christ, showing that human failure does not hinder divine providence. Judah himself had acted unjustly, withholding his promise and pushing Tamar into desperation. Yet even through his failure, God's plan was not stopped. Instead, Tamar's courage brought the truth to light, and the children she bore became part of the messianic line. This reveals how God works not in spite of human brokenness, but often through it, weaving redemption out of threads that seem tangled. For those who reflect on her story, it can feel surprising that Tamar is honored in Scripture at all. Yet her presence in the genealogy of Jesus stands as a declaration that God's grace reaches beyond social expectations and human judgments. What the world calls scandal, God transforms into salvation. Her name, written into the record of Christ's ancestry, proves that no life is too complicated or too tarnished to be used for his glory. The mysterious nature of God's plan is that he often brings triumph out of situations that seem destined for despair. Tamar's experience of betrayal could have left her story unfinished, but her persistence turned the very circumstances meant to silence her into the avenue of blessing. Her risk, though misunderstood, became the foundation for a legacy of faith that would bless countless generations. Her story also highlights the transformation of Judah himself. His confession, "She is more righteous than I," marked a turning point in his character. Later, Judah would emerge as a leader among his brothers, offering himself as a substitute for Benjamin when the family faced Joseph in Egypt. Tamar's courage had not only secured her future, but had also played a part in reshaping Judah's heart, which would influence the destiny of the entire tribe of Judah. The tribe that bore Judah's name would become the tribe of kings, the tribe from which David arose, and ultimately the tribe from which Christ came. Tamar's persistence had safeguarded this legacy. What began in personal pain became the foundation for God's grand design, proving that his purposes cannot be undone by human failure. This mysterious plan reminds us that God's work is often hidden in the ordinary struggles of life. It may not look glorious in the moment, but through patience and faith, his design is revealed. Tamar could not have foreseen that her actions would shape the line of the Messiah, yet her courage became a vital part of salvation history. The journey from scandal to salvation is not a straight path, but it is one that reveals the heart of God. He delights in lifting up those who have been cast down, redeeming what seems broken, and writing hope into stories that seem hopeless. Tamar's life is a living example of this truth, a reminder that God's mysterious plan is always greater than the judgments of men. Through Tamar, we see that redemption is not reserved for the perfect, but is given to those who cling to justice, who persevere through trials, and who trust that their story can be part of something far greater than themselves. Her place in salvation's story is not an accident, but a declaration that God's plan embraces the unexpected, the misunderstood, and the overlooked. When the Gospel of Matthew opens with the genealogy of Jesus, it includes a surprising detail. Unlike most ancient genealogies that mention only men, Matthew highlights the names of several women. Tamar is the first among them, followed by Rahab, Ruth, Bathsheba, and Mary. Each of these women carried a story that society might have overlooked, yet God chose to honor them as part of his redemptive plan. Tamar's presence among these names speaks volumes. She was not a matriarch celebrated for wealth or power, but a woman whose life had been marked by suffering, silence, and risk. Yet her courage and determination placed her at the foundation of the messianic line. Her inclusion in the genealogy declares that God values faith and persistence more than outward appearances. Rahab, like Tamar, came from a story marked by stigma. A woman of Jericho, she risked everything to protect the Israelite spies, and her faith placed her in the line of Christ. Ruth, a Moabite widow, left her homeland to follow Naomi and found redemption in her loyalty and humility. Bathsheba, remembered for her connection to King David, endured scandal, yet became the mother of Solomon. Mary, a young woman of Nazareth, carried the greatest honor and the greatest risk, chosen to bear the Son of God. Each of these women was surrounded by circumstances that others might have judged harshly. Yet God saw beyond human judgment. He saw faith, courage, loyalty, and willingness to step into the unknown. Tamar's place among them highlights that God's story is not written through flawless lives, but through those who cling to him in their struggles. Tamar's courage to act when all seemed lost places her in the company of these remarkable women. Together, they form a tapestry of stories that show God's heart for the marginalized, the misunderstood, and the overlooked. None of them were forgotten. Their names shine at the very beginning of the Gospel, reminding every reader that salvation came through a line shaped by women of resilience. The inclusion of women in the genealogy also reflects a divine reversal. In a world where women's voices were often silenced, God ensured their names would be spoken in the story of his Son. Tamar's presence is not accidental, but intentional, a sign that her story matters, that her courage was not hidden from God's sight. Her place among giants of faith shows that God's plan for redemption has always included those who seemed unlikely. Tamar stood in the shadows for much of her life, but her legacy stands in the light of Scripture, side by side with women whose faith changed the course of history. These women's lives remind us that God does not measure worth by social standing or by how polished one's story appears. He honors the faithful, the bold, the ones who trust him in the midst of trials. Tamar's name, written in the genealogy, is proof that he redeems the broken pieces and turns them into cornerstones of his kingdom. Tamar's story, read alongside Rahab, Ruth, Bathsheba, and Mary, becomes part of a larger testimony. Each woman demonstrates that God's grace is wide, his purpose is deep, and his redemption limitless. Together, they show that no one is beyond his plan, and that through unexpected people, his greatest work unfolds. Her place in the genealogy is not just a historical detail, it is a declaration. Tamar is remembered not for her suffering, but for her courage, not for her silence, but for her determination, not for her vulnerability, but for her legacy. She belongs among giants, for her faith carved a path that would lead to the Messiah himself. The story of Tamar may seem distant, buried in the ancient past, yet its lessons reach into our present with remarkable clarity. Her courage, her persistence, and her determination to seek justice speak directly to the struggles we face in our own lives. Tamar's journey is not just a historical account. It is a living reminder of how resilience and faith can transform despair into destiny. One of the first lessons we draw from her life is the power of persistence. Tamar refused to accept a future of silence and erasure. Though she waited patiently for years, when it became clear that Judah would not fulfill his promise, she acted with wisdom and courage. Her persistence teaches us that when injustice weighs heavily, we are called not to give up, but to seek the path that brings restoration. Her story also highlights the importance of wisdom in times of hardship. Tamar did not rush into reckless decisions. She thought carefully, planned with foresight, and ensured that her actions would lead to truth being revealed. In our lives, we too face moments where wisdom is needed, where patience must walk hand in hand with courage. Tamar shows us that true strength lies not only in boldness, but in discernment. Another lesson from her story is the reminder that God's purposes are not hindered by human failure. Judah's broken promise could have left Tamar forgotten, yet her determination allowed God's plan to move forward. In our lives, we may feel that the failures of others or our own mistakes have left us without hope. Tamar's story assures us that God can weave redemption even out of the most tangled threads. Tamar also teaches us about the courage to confront injustice. She did not remain silent forever. When the time was right, she presented the truth, not with anger, but with undeniable clarity. Her example encourages us to face challenges with integrity, trusting that truth has the power to bring light where there is darkness. Her life reminds us that honor does not always come from the approval of society. For much of her story, Tamar was judged harshly or overlooked entirely. Yet God saw her faithfulness and inscribed her name into the genealogy of his son. In our own lives, we may feel unseen or unappreciated. But Tamar's story encourages us to remember that God's recognition matters far more than human praise. Her presence in the gospel genealogy also challenges us to value the overlooked voices in our own communities. Just as God honored Tamar and other women often dismissed in their time, we too are called to recognize the worth of those society ignores. Tamar's courage pushes us to stand with those who are marginalized, to ensure that justice is not denied to the vulnerable. For those walking through seasons of waiting, Tamar offers encouragement. Her years of uncertainty did not define her final story. Though she endured silence and betrayal, her persistence led to breakthrough. Her life whispers hope to anyone who feels trapped in waiting, reminding us that our story is not over and that God can still bring forth a future filled with purpose. Tamar's courage lives on as a call to us today. It is a call to stand firm in the face of disappointment, to act with wisdom when justice seems delayed, to believe that God can redeem even the most broken circumstances, and to trust that our lives too can be part of his greater story. Her story, written long ago, still breathes encouragement into our present. Tamar teaches us that no situation is too hopeless, no betrayal too deep, and no silence too long for God to transform it into a legacy of hope. She reminds us to live with courage, with faith, and with the confidence that what seems hidden can one day become a testimony of redemption. Tamar's journey, marked by sorrow, betrayal, boldness, and vindication, comes together in one unshakable truth. Her name is forever written into the line of the Messiah. She was not forgotten, she was not erased, and she was not defined by the shadows of her early years. Instead, she became a living testimony of how God takes what seems broken and weaves it into his plan of redemption. From the depths of silence, Tamar's life rose to stand at the threshold of salvation history, carried forward through Perez, through David, and ultimately through Christ himself. Her story does not shine because it was free of struggle, but because through every obstacle she held on to the dignity and justice that were hers by right. She was a woman who refused to let her voice be silenced, who waited patiently, yet acted decisively when the time came. Through her, we see that God honors courage, persistence, and faith, even when the world dismisses or misunderstands them. Tamar's life reminds us that no story is too complicated, no past too marked, and no circumstance too tangled for God to use. What others might call scandal, he calls redemption. What others might see as weakness, he sees as strength. And what others might attempt to erase, he inscribes forever into his eternal story. Her presence in the genealogy of Jesus is more than a historical footnote. It is a declaration that the Savior came not through a line of perfect people, but through men and women who bore scars, who carried pain, and who lived stories full of unexpected turns. Tamar's name at the beginning of the gospel narrative tells us that Christ came for people like her, and Christ came for people like us. The lessons of Tamar's life extend far beyond her own time. They speak to everyone who has felt overlooked, betrayed, or forgotten. They speak to those who are waiting for promises to be fulfilled, to those who face injustice, and to those who wonder if their story has meaning. Tamar's legacy declares with confidence that our stories too can be written into the great story of God's redemption. Through Tamar we learn that courage can change the future, that persistence can carry a legacy, and that faith can overcome silence. She was not a queen on a throne, but her place in history outshines many who held earthly power. She was a woman who endured, who acted wisely, and who left a legacy that reached all the way to the birth of the Messiah. Tamar's life, remembered across generations, continues to shine as a light of hope. Her journey from sorrow to significance reminds us that no moment is wasted in the hands of God. Her name, written into the genealogy of Jesus Christ, assures us that his plan embraces every person, even those society might overlook. So let Tamar's story inspire you today. Let it encourage you to hold fast when waiting feels endless, to act with wisdom when faced with obstacles, and to trust that your story, too, can become part of something greater. Tamar's courage lives on as a witness that God is faithful, that justice matters, and that redemption can rise from even the darkest places. Her name stands at the opening of the gospel as a beacon of hope, showing that every life has the potential to be woven into the fabric of God's kingdom. Tamar was written into the line of the Messiah, and through Christ, we are invited into that same story of redemption, restoration, and eternal purpose. This is Tamar's untold story, a story that speaks across generations, reminding us that our lives are never too hidden, never too broken, and never too small to be used in the hands of God. If this story moved you and gave you a new perspective on Tamar's incredible journey, I encourage you to subscribe to the channel so you never miss future messages like this. Like this video to help it reach others, leave a comment to share your thoughts and reflections, and share it with your friends and loved ones so they too can be encouraged by Tamar's legacy. Together, let us keep these stories alive and continue walking in the light of their lessons.